Let's Take This Outside with Marianne Iveson, the podcast where she speaks to athletes, outdoor professionals, and scientists about why they connect with nature.
Frank Wolf is a Canadian adventurer, writer, filmmaker, and environmentalist. He is known for books, feature magazine articles, online columns, and films that document wilderness expeditions around the world with a focus on the Canadian North. His expeditions include being the first to canoe across Canada in one season, rowing the Northwest Passage, and circumnavigating both Haida, Gwaii, and Vancouver Island by kayak. In 2020, he was named one of Canada's greatest 90 explorers of all time by Canadian Geographic. Please welcome Frank Wolf. Frank Wolf, welcome to Let's Take This Outside. Thank you so much for joining me, finally.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
We have a few connections because the outdoor world is so small, but former guest and friend of mine, Lee McAdam, recommended that I speak with you. I don't know if you know Lee or not.
I'm not sure. I don't know if I've met Lee in person.
She runs a blog called Hike, Bike, Travel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But I also saw, we were talking about this beforehand, you just chatted with Kevin Callan, the happy camper, on his podcast, and he was a former guest as well. One of the quirkiest, funnest interviews I've ever had. How did yours go?
Yeah, it was great. Kevin, I've known him for years in kind of the canoe world circles as it is. And yeah, just a really genuinely nice guy.
Yeah.
Great sense of humor. Yeah, lots of knowledge, really genuine. Yeah, I love Kevin.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so I want to talk about your new book, Two Springs, One Summer, that you just released in the fall. But let's go back to the early days a little bit. Like, where did your love of nature begin? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up actually in Toronto, believe it or not, the nature hub of Canada. But yeah, my folks they were European immigrants that came, when they're in their late 20s to Canada for a couple of 2-year adventure, starting having kids and never left. But we'd all spend our summers in kind of northern Ontario, camping. I was in a canoe at like 6 weeks old. Yeah, so they kind of connected me with that. And then when I was 13, we bought a little cabin up in northern Ontario, like a little cottage, and spent a lot of time and still do spend like a couple of months a year there. Just a simple cabin built in the 50s. It's got a sauna, and it's also connected to all the grand waterways of Canada. So I've done a couple of big trips that have finished there. I paddled there once from Winnipeg. The cottage is 3 hours north of Toronto in Parry Sound. And I've also paddled there once from there to Ottawa, touring my friend's album in a documentary I shot called Wild One. So it's kind of become also a place where I've kind of finished and started adventures over the years too.
Since I'm based in Ottawa, what's the route that you would have taken to get to Ottawa?
Yeah, so we started in Parry Sound at the cottage, and we went basically through Massasauga Provincial Park, then up the Moon River, across Lake Muskoka, up the Muskoka River, up Lake of Bays, up the Ox Tongue, then through the whole park, basically south to north, coming out in the Mab du Fond, into the Mattawa River, then onto the Ottawa River, down to Ottawa.
You have paddled literally everywhere, though, but I've heard a couple times that Ottawa and the Ottawa River has some great, whitewater. I don't know if you do whitewater or not, but has some really great whitewater.
Yeah, I'm a whitewater kayaker as well. So
okay, I assumed.
Where I live in North Vancouver, just down the hill, there's a river like the Seymour River. You can paddle the Capilano, so there's some good little local whitewater runs. And on that one, we were canoe tripping, so we were doing some light rapids, but you can portage anything. So there's some big rapids at the rafting companies and whitewater will hit there. But if you want to canoe down, it's easy to kind of hop around on the portage if you don't want to do the big kind of class 4+ drop or whatever. So, yeah.
And I do want to plug Kevin Callan for a second, because he has a ton of great resources, especially in Ontario, for canoeing in those routes. So absolutely. I think, he's the guy. So, okay, so you grew up, you're in Northern Ontario. I spent some time in Sudbury, so I understand that kind of...
Yeah, Sudbury is like an hour and a half north of the cottage, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a totally different terrain than we experience in Ottawa or Southern Ontario, right? So what point were you like, oh, I could explore for a living? Did you have real jobs? Did you have real jobs before you dove into that?
It's definitely more of a lifestyle than a living. You don't make much money doing this thing with your passion. It's just enjoyable and it's exciting. It's kind of, when I'm on a long journey, I'm kind of my ideal self in the sense that it's just a simple way to move. Your canoe is where you go to work, and your tent is your home, and your job is just moving forward. It's that simple kind of way of travel in the wilderness. And there's nothing else to kind of distract you. So I was a long distance runner since I was grade 4. I eventually went to University of Michigan to run as well for a couple of years. So kind of higher end competitive distance runner. And that kind of mentality, that distance running mentality really lends itself to the discipline of like long distance tripping. If you want to squeeze in and, 13, 14, 1500 kilometers in a month, you kind of have to be consistent, and every day is the same, no rest days. You just kind of keep on moving and you put your 10 hours a day in, and eventually you'll get there. If you're going upstream, downstream, any kind of mode of travel, as long as you have enough time and enough of varied terrain, you're going to get there. And that kind of discipline and kind of being uncomfortable is kind of a joyful way to kind of be. And that probably comes originally from that grounding in like long distance sports.
Right. You like suffering is what you're saying.
One person might call it suffering, but I think one person's suffering is another person's joy. It's something you get used to. So if I'm out there 10 hours a day, it's kind of quite pleasurable. I'm fully engaged. I don't really think about the physical part of it. It's just you're so into this kind of, I never repeat my journeys. I never go back and do the same big trip twice. So I know when I'm doing it, this is the first and the last time I'm going to be like seeing this beautiful stretch of river, seeing that herd of caribou crossing. And it really keeps you in that moment. So you don't even think about the difficulty involved in putting yourself in that position. It's more about being there and kind of being cognizant that, this is the first and last time you'll be on this beautiful stretch of wilderness.
Considering how remote you go, right? You're like, literally, this is the first and last time I'll ever see this.
Yeah, because there's so much to explore. Everyone's going out the same way, right? No one gets out alive. So I know every year, every trip I do, it's going to be a new stretch of land, a new vision, a new perspective. It's a very fresh, exciting kind of way to live when you do these journeys. So when I do, 2 or 3 big journeys a year, they're always going to be something different than the one before. And you always learn that way too. If you get into this kind of comfortable, because if you start repeating things, you get very comfortable doing it. And if you're comfortable, you're not really learning. You're not really pushing yourself into situations where you are forced to kind of learn, which is what these new trips are always kind of adding to your repertoire of skills and experience when you're out there doing different journeys every year.
Well, you have a book, the new book, 2 Springs, 1 Summer, but were you always documenting your trips? I'm sure the technology has changed over the years, but were you journaling at the time? Did you turn into like video? How have you been documenting all of your expeditions?
My first big trip that really hooked me into this, I was 24 years old and had the opportunity to canoe across Canada. Myself and my partner at the time, we canoed from the Bay of Fundy to Vancouver. So 171-day trip. 7,000 kilometers across Canada. And so that way of living, the day-to-day simplicity really hooked into it. And that's also the same time I started journaling. So I started keeping a really detailed journal. It's kind of a good practice, kind of every day, writing in detail, logging, distance, what you saw, what you're thinking and feeling. And I really liked that process as part of the whole thing. And then that eventually led to, writing articles and now books. And also I made films over the years as well. Did a bunch of films for the CBC documentary channel on my trips. And those were all independently shot, edited, produced. But I've kind of moved away from filmmaking the last few years. Kind of felt I was repeating myself a little bit too much with that. And if you're going to do a film, you really have to almost consider it's like another person on the journey with you. You really have to consider the film as far as like, should I film this rapid? Should I talk about something here? And it's a big commitment. And so if you're not going to be fully committed, and especially with the way it's moved as far as media, you can't really get a broadcast license so easily to sell a film to the CBC. It's all kind of streaming and it's very watered down. So in terms of any kind of financial benefit, it doesn't exist anymore. So if I'm going to do that, I'd rather just write and photograph. It's just the simplicity of it as well, right? And I enjoy that even more.
So what I'm hearing kind of, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's almost too distracting to film every single angle. And like, I kind of know how many angles and shots and hours of footage it must take to make one,
exactly.
even short film, right?
If you're going to commit to that. And so I was doing like 46-minute, like broadcast length documentaries. And I still knew once I had a shot in the bag, I wouldn't repeat it. So you have to kind of still move the trip along as if you don't have a camera, but then you're always considering that extra step. And it's very creative and fun when you're doing it as well. But then once kind of the peripheral benefits weren't as good, then I just stopped doing it. So
don't blame me.
And I enjoyed it. Also, like once you've done a canoe film, like I did one film. By the time I got towards the end, I did one film just shot from the perspective of a mosquito, just to make it interesting for me. Right? It's a film called Katuriak. People can watch it on YouTube. And so just to make it different. So there's so many different angles and ways you can film a canoe trip. Ultimately, it's still a canoe trip. So to make that kind of fresh and original, it has to be fresh to me to keep doing it too. And once I started thinking, I've done this before, I've shot this before, this is kind of the same thing I did a film ago, I just said, I'll step away from that. So
you go on these remote locations quite a bit. Is there any part of you that maybe doesn't like modern technology, or like you're finally in cell service? Do you like roll your eyes? Or are you looking forward to messages that you get? Or how do you feel when you're probably off the grid for days and then you finally come back into service?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, that's it. I mean, if I did a 36-day canoe trip just this past July, August with a friend, left from Yellowknife and just went straight north in the Yellowknife River upstream for like 10 days to start the trip. And then, but pretty quickly, once you we're out of cell service immediately almost. And then, yeah, so that's great. I mean, there's no distraction. It's like I guess an unintentional detox. And yeah, it's just that simplicity. It takes away, you're kind of grounding into what it means to be an animal or a human or whatever. Is we're not supposed to be looking at our phones all day. We're supposed to be immersed and present in the environment we're in. And that's what it forces you to be. There's nothing to distract you. I have an inReach, of course, so I'll send like a haiku out every night onto a map share so people can follow us along that way. But I'll just do that once a day, send out a little 575 haiku so people can see where we're camping. The haiku kind of captures a moment of the day or the essence of the day. And I share those haikus in that book, Two Springs, One Summer. I kind of share all the haikus that I write. That's nice. If you're like paddling all day, it's like a long, flat stretch of lake or whatever. It's kind of something you can play around with in your head. It's a simple little box. How do I kind of capture this day or this moment in that 575? And it's kind of like something you can play around with in your mind. And then I'll put in my journal, share it with folks along the way. But that's about the only kind of communication I'm getting. And you just kind of step away from it all. So that's the beauty of it as well, for sure. And
it's only one-way communication too. You're the one sending no reply.
Exactly.
But okay, not to put you in the spot, but I'm going to. Can you give me an example of a haiku that you'd send out?
Yeah, geez, I'm trying to think. Yeah, a good one.
He's getting up to grab his book. Has anyone asked you that before?
Yeah, I should have had these like up already. They're in a big bag here already, but live unboxing.
I feel like I'm in a YouTube video.
Exactly. But yeah, so I'll just shoot randomly. Let's go chapter 35 here. It opens with, so a lone Austrian, there's your 5, subsisting on fish and grit. There's line 2, 7 syllables. And last line, on a vision quest. So you kind of have your setup and then your finale. So a lone Austrian, subsisting on fish and grit, on a vision quest. And that's basically from middle of the canoe trip. We hadn't seen anyone for days, and there was just this little tent on the shore flapping away in the breeze. As we were going on the trip, I talk about, we went from Yellowknife to Chantry Inlet, basically went to the source of the Back River, and then all the way up to Chantry Inlet, like a 1,750 kilometer trip that I detail in the book. And that was, we just saw this lone paddler on the shoreline, and then went in, and he was a funny guy, this guy, Bernie. We kind of chat right away. He was like excited to see us, runs down to the shore, and we had a beautiful tailwind. It's like a beautiful tailwind, 50-kilometer long lake. And you kind of want to take advantage of those conditions. But Bernie was kind of say, Bernie, you should take advantage of this tailwind. What's going on here? Oh, I've got to debone the fish. What do you mean debone the fish? You have to go to debone the fish. So he had a big pot of fish he just caught, and basically he was living on fish that he would basically debone and then pickle in jars. And so he would just eat jarred fish the entire time. So he was spending the morning in this beautiful tailwind to get there. And he was already kind of behind his time. He got stuck by ice on Great Slave Lake. But that wasn't his priority. His priority wasn't moving. And he said, would you like to watch me debone the fish? I politely declined, and we kept on going. And I kind of kept in contact with him a little bit. And so he ended up, probably for reasons like deboning the fish, he never actually ended up getting down the entire Back River. Got to the back, partway down, and then he had to get picked up by a plane because it got pinned in by those north winds that kind of kick in the north kind of come August. So, but he just was happy being out there. But that was just a little haiku about that moment, meeting Bernie on that day.
For you to be able to like instantly go back to that story is actually super impressive, that you know exactly what that haiku was from.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. The haiku, it kind of will pop in your head that moment. It'll kind of crystallize it for you. And that's a nice thing about haiku. You're put in this box of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, but it takes some thought to make something that condensed, right? If you write like paragraphs and paragraphs, it's never going to be as intense as that little 575 poem.
It's kind of this perfect way to probably end the day. It's small enough, but like just enough to like just get that like creative bone in your body going,
exactly.
Right?
It's kind of a meditative practice in many ways, right? It forces you to reflect on the day and to pick that haiku out of that day and do that every day, right? So it's kind of part of my journaling process. And I started it in 2007, when I paddled from Winnipeg to the cottage, like 3,100 km, up through the northern Ontario, across Lake Winnipeg, up into the Albany, and then Missinaibi, Matagami, through Temagami, eventually back to the cottage. It was like a 75-day trip. I went with my friend Taku Hokoyama, Japanese, speaks Japanese, writes in Japanese, and he was actually doing the haikus in a script, like an actual calligraphy script, in a proper book. And I thought, well, if Taku's going to do like a proper Japanese haiku, I'm going to do like, our North American version with 575. So that ever since that time, through Taku's inspiration, I've written haikus every single day and every single journey since 2007. So I have thousands of haikus that I've written over the years. Would you ever release just a haiku book? I've talked about it, just kind of I'm sure it would be a very esoteric and wouldn't sell many copies. It would be a fun project. I thought at one point doing like almost like so I do a lot of photography along the way, like a coffee table book where you'd have a haiku and then like an image that relates to that haiku from the journey. So you have almost like an image and a haiku, do like 40 of those, 40 pages, 40 images, 40 haikus. So kind of like the best of the best with the matching images would be kind of a cool project at one point. So yeah. Very cool creative project. Yeah, exactly. I feel like I kind of know the answer to this, but what draws you to remote locations? I'm assuming it's because you grew up in kind of Northern Ontario. It's hard to get away from, like you said, you were talking about like the kind of the noise and the technology and everything that exists in society in general. But, and I think Canada is very unique. I mean, I've done travels in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Europe, I've canoed across Scandinavia, different journeys like that. But to find these kind of remote areas are very rare and very precious. And in Canada, we have that. I mean, it's ultimate freedom ultimately, right? So if you're on a journey, basically, like myself and my friend Arturo, who I did the trip with, it's us two. We're our own little world. There's no one else around it involved. I can do anything. I don't need to ask for permission. You just kind of find your route and you just go and you just move. And it's like everything is whatever decision you make, good or bad, it's on you. And that's kind of the beauty of it. And you have this kind of, thousands of kilometers in front of you, a vast landscape, and you never know what you're going to see every single day. It's like a real adventure. It's kind of like seeing things. For me, I'm seeing things for the first time. It's almost like what original, say, Indigenous people or explorers would going into these areas for the first time. It would be the sense of wonder that you can't really get in the modern world, where it's you kind of know what to expect. And there's, no matter where you're going, there's going to be people trying to sway you into their way of doing things or criticize you for doing this or that. When you're out there on your own in the wilderness, you don't have that. It's kind of this freedom. And that's ultimately what it's all about. Your new book, Two Springs, One Summer, which is about very challenging expeditions in the Arctic. Can you tell me more about them and how you choose your routes? Yeah, so these trips are like, I don't always do my own routes. Basically in the book, it's like a long form narrative that kind of shares 10 months in a semi-typical kind of year for me, where I'm doing like 3 journeys in the course of that time. And for this one, the first journey is across Baffin Island skiing. And that was kind of actually created by my friend Dave Garrow, who I've done lots of these Arctic ski journeys with. He's a good friend of mine. He works in Banff as a bear biologist. We did another trip just recently, about 325 kilometers in the Clyde River region. But this one is a Baffin Island trip. So myself, Dave, and our friend Johnny, we did that trip. And so that one was something that Dave had concocted, and I came on as part of the team, which is also great, right? Instead of always planning the trips yourself, it's nice to step onto a trip as well. Yeah, latch yourself onto it and be like, I'm coming. Yeah, and then I end up doing, the photography and writing a feature article for a magazine on it as well. I wrote a feature for Mountain Life in that particular case. And then the next one is one I created, which is the 1,750 kilometer route. And basically it's because I'd never been there. I canoed the Thelon to Rankin Inlet from Yellowknife before, but this one took the north arm, the east arm of the lake, did the Pikes Portage, worked our way to the headwaters of the back, and then all the way down to Chantry Inlet in the Arctic Ocean. So that was, again, just an area I hadn't been to before. I'd always heard about the legendary Back River and its 83 whitewater rapids and all that sort of thing. So just wanted to see it with my own eyes. So that's how that came together. And a different person, Ryan, I did it this time. I hadn't traveled with him before. And definitely different. He's kind of like a younger guy than me, much more technologically dependent, I would say. But I guess the journey also, we didn't see eye to eye necessarily. And I kind of, in my book, I don't want to be negatively critical of people. I'm critical of myself as much as my partners, and kind of, give them their kudos. And sometimes if you don't see eye to eye, you kind of express that as well. But Ryan, great guy, very capable. He'd skied the whole coast range of the West Coast before on a long journey. But he was like watching YouTube videos on his phone at night and stuff like that. So he was clinging to that technology for the first 3 weeks of the trip until eventually the nature and the wilderness eventually got to him. That he started reading my books, put away the phone, and it's just kind of, he slowly transitioned. It takes a while. I think anyone's out there long enough will start to tap into that old way of living eventually when you've been out there long enough, and you slowly, like on these journeys, basically what happens is it takes for me about a couple of weeks to kind of shed my civilized skin and just kind of be kind of a wild hunted animal. And that's kind of what you're being. And you kind of, the person you were in civilized society is gone, and your normal is that trip if you're out there long enough. So kind of moving through time, that becomes the normal, and it kind of is what happens as well. And then the third journey was a ski trip retracing the route of John Ray, who had discovered that the Franklin expedition back in 1854, that they'd all perished. So we kind of were retracing his overland journey with, again, another team. So 3 different teams, 3 different journeys, 3 different dynamics, and kind of bringing people intimately into that experience is what the book's all about.
Let's Take This Outside now has a newsletter. Keep up to date with outdoor news, events, and great discount codes and deals from our partners. Sign up today at letstakethisoutside.ca.
I'm actually going cross-country skiing after we're done chatting.
Awesome.
And I'm one of those, like, I'll go for, a few hours. I love skate skiing and classic skiing. But, like, I love, like, just a nice... And Gatineau has a wonderful... I don't know if you've skied before.
World class, for sure, yeah.
World-class trails. But very lucky they have, little cabins along the way. They have Chelsea where you can go grab a coffee after and chill.
Yeah.
So as you're describing the ski adventures in northern remote nowhere, I'm just imagining, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's nowhere to other than his own camp. You just have to commit. You must be so dialed in on your layers. Ski expeditions must be literally life or death at that point when it comes to.
Yeah, it's definitely,
right?
it's a beautiful time to travel. If you're in the Arctic typically May is the best month because it's not as cold. You have 24 hours of daylight. So great traveling conditions. And, you get down to minus 20 overnight, but during the day it's pushing up towards 0. So it's kind of nice.
Okay.
Travel temperatures.
Okay. So it's not.
It can be. You can definitely, you can get a whistling north wind coming in, and you're kind of in your hard shell layers all day, kind of moving to keep the wind from cutting through you. But also once you're in that tent, these amazing tents, we have this, it's like a Hellsport expedition tent. And once you're inside, the tent with the stove running, the wind cut, you kind of make a little seat, you kind of dig into the snow. So you have a drop inside the vestibule. And so one person runs the stove, the other people are just sitting there in the tent. It's kind of quite cozy. It's like a different world. You're transitioning from this. It could be minus 20 and blowing outside, but inside it's, 5 to 10 degrees. You're just, chatting about, the weather or whatever. You're just chatting about, world politics, anything, as you're kind of hanging out in this kind of little capsule of comfort in the middle of, say, an ice field at 6,000 feet. So it's kind of a cool kind of contrast. Of course, it's your lifeline. But with an experienced team, like with Johnny and Dave, we get on great. We've done several trips now. Everyone knows their place and how to keep this kind of system going and to work together to make it kind of, and same thing, like in a canoe, instead you're pulling a sled behind you with all your gear. And so moving over the glaciers and across the fjords and through the mountains with this kind of little self-contained setup.
I notice you do trips with other people a lot. I'm assuming it's probably logistics. Sometimes maybe it's, just recording photography. But how do you pick adventure partners, and how do you like it compared to solo travel?
I did a 2-week solo kayak trip on the outer islands of the northern BC coast from Prince Rupert, and then around Banks Island, Campania, down to Bella Bella. So that was my first kind of experience doing a real longer solo, a 400-kilometer trip there. And that was great as well. But I do like the dynamic of traveling with another person or people, small teams. I never do more than one canoe. I don't do 2 canoes on a trip. It's myself and one other person in a single canoe. Then you don't have that push and pull of if you have 2 canoes, you're not going to be always the same pace. I think it just makes things more complex when you're adding more canoes to a journey. But 2 people in a canoe is going to be much more efficient as pushing a trip along than one person. So if you're moving a canoe and maneuvering through whitewater in a tandem canoe, it's like a 17-foot escape prospector is what I always use. And it's just a much more efficient way to travel through the landscape. And that kind of back and forth dynamic and rapport is fun. That's, the adventure of getting to know someone better or to kind of work out how we can move this thing together is also interesting as well, right? So, yeah, and I choose my partners. Sometimes it's repeating partners like Dave and Johnny. We've done several of these kind of Arctic ski journeys up in Ellesmere Island, Devon Island, Baffin Island. So we kind of know we can kind of click in pretty easily. And other times it's like I can't get anybody else. And like this past summer, I'm 54 years old, but my partner was a 24-year-old named Arturo. And on Granville Island, one of the jobs I do in between is wrecking boats and doing demolition. And Arturo, young guy, he'd grind away with the sawzall and the grinder, for 8-10 hours a day, happily wrecking boats in a cloud of fiberglass. And if you can do that, you can transition that mentality into a canoe trip. It's the same thing, right? He'd never been on a canoe trip before. I don't look at my partners for someone who you can teach the canoeing along the way. It's more about that mentality, that comfort and discomfort, and kind of an easy rapport with the person as well. So A, you have to get along with them, and B, you have to know that they're going to be able to handle difficulty and discomfort and thrive and rise to the occasion every day, which Arturo was amazing. He was beyond expectations as a great partner. And so you discover people along the way and you give them a chance. But I've been doing this for so long, like my original partners, they've got families and kids and careers and, people's lives go in different directions. I keep on doing the same thing and you have to pick up different people along the way to keep it going. So my partners are kind of like, I keep getting older, but my canoe tripping partners stay the same age because I'm just going back to the 20-year-old well now all the time for these.
Well, they have no commitments.
Young, fresh bodies, strong backs, it's perfect.
Yeah. They have no commitments. They probably don't have kids. They're probably not married. They're strong. They're young. They're maybe a little stupid, and that they think that they can
into an adventure and kind of like, So you can find these people out there, but it's definitely not a random pick on Facebook.
Yeah,
definitely people I've had that.
Imagine
that happens. People do that. I mean, people throw out these kind of, we're looking for partners for a trip. You see it on Facebook all the time or whatever, and it's just they're throwing it out there into the world, and you don't know who you're going to get, right? So you don't want the person to implode the journey. You want them to be able to do it, right?
I remember Adam Schultz had brought, definitely wasn't a Facebook, and I forget what adventure it was, but he had brought a guy, like an MMA fighter with him on one of his journeys. So yeah, I think it's someone who's just has that mental fortitude to make it through.
Exactly. Yeah. So someone you can trust and know, and someone they're going to be fine no matter, if the chips are down or you have to, portage all day long or drag upstream all day long. It's just kind of someone who can kind of, thrive in that sort of environment.
We had to delay our chat because I think it was because you were in Churchill, Manitoba. And this has popped up for me so many times because I'm part of the Travel Media Association of Canada. And the amount of journalists who have gone to Churchill to look at the polar bears, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know it was a thing till this year. But you guide those tours, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so can you tell me what that's all about? Because it seems a little scary, but also like a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Yeah, I mean, the one unique thing about Churchill, Manitoba is it's the only place in the world you can go and pretty much be guaranteed of seeing a polar bear in the wild. Everywhere else, there are polar bears, but they're very random. They're spread out. Churchill's unique in the sense that, you have a community there at the end of the rail line at the mouth of the Churchill River. And because of that, all that fresh water flushing into Churchill, the water freezes there first. And the bears, basically, they can only get seals, their primary food source, when there's ice. And the bears know the ice comes in first at Churchill. So the bears, for like 6 weeks of the year, early October till mid-November, will come in and they'll just hang out on the shoreline waiting for that ice to freeze. And once it's frozen there, boom, they're gone out there in Hudson Bay for the next, 8 months or 7 months, as long as the ice lasts. So they know their mothers have taken the cubs there and said, this is where we hang out. And so they keep coming back every year. And it just happens to coincide. So in this wildlife management area, you head out in these big tundra buggies. So you're very safe. You're like, 10 feet off the ground and you just kind of park there. It's kind of like we're in the zoo and the bears will come and take a look at us if they want. So you'll see a bear from a distance. You approach kind of nice and quiet, don't want to scare it off. And sometimes they'll come and curiously, walk right up there. And there'll be sometimes the young males will be sparring. So both up on their legs, 2 10-foot males kind of battling each other in a friendly, they're kind of sharpening their skills for hunting. At that time of year, they're not fighting each other to death during mating season, say, for example. It's kind of like just more of this kind of coming together to kind of sharpen up their skills and kill some time before the ice comes in. So you see all these amazing interactions with the bears on the land in their habitat. Mothers and cubs will come in there too. So you see all sorts of things. The company I work for, Frontiers North, we also have like a lodge. It's kind of a temporary pop-up lodge. It's out there for 6 weeks. We drive them out there. There's a couple of like bunk cars where people will stay, lounge, dining area. So people will be having like a fancy, 3-course, beautiful gourmet meal while polar bears are walking by the window kind of thing. So it's kind of like puts you, and you're out in the middle of this thing called Polar Bear Point in the tundra, only accessible by these big buggies. So it's kind of a very unique experience. It's very comfortable, but the bears are all around. And there's lots of rules about, you don't touch the ground. There's never any kind of feeding of the bears that'll kick you off the trip. They don't habituate them, but it lets you kind of see the bears in their natural environment and get pretty up close and personal. They'll come right underneath the observation deck, say in a tundra buggy. It's just like a metal grate. And so you can be literally like an inch from a bear's nose as it's sniffing up through the grate and kind of curiously looking at you kind of thing. So you're kind of in this kind of moving, roving zoo as the bears kind of come and look at you. So, yeah.
It's top of my list. My boyfriend loves bears, and I think he would probably, it's top of my list to save for a trip like that, to bring him and surprise him and be like, this is like a once in a lifetime. There's lots of ways you
can do it. Some people will go, you can do like a package tour. We can also just go out and get there on your own and then say do a one-dayer on one of these buggies. There's also companies that also just kind of rove around town. They don't have permits to go into the wildlife management area, but the bears do literally come right through town often. There's something called Polar Bear Alert that is, it's basically a number you can call. If you spot a bear in town, they'll come and they'll basically haze the bears north of town so there's no bad interactions with people. The bears will swim across the Churchill River and probably not come back to town. There's something called Polar Bear Jail there, like a polar bear holding facility. So if there's a bad bear that keeps coming back to town that's too curious, they'll actually put the bear in this holding facility. Just kind of, keep it going with water, keep it uncomfortable. And then once the ice comes in, the bear will head off on the ice. So there's kind of like these measures to kind of keep bears and people safe, and they do a great job. So there haven't been any bad interactions for at least 10 years in town in terms of bears and people. So like someone getting hurt, for example. So, yeah.
That's incredible. You must have noticed in your journeys the last probably 25 years plus, you've noticed environmental changes, I'm guessing. So this sparked I'm assuming the ice, as when you're spending so much time in northern Canada, you must be seeing the environmental damage and progression that's been happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to see on a singular journey, unless you're living up there like the local Indigenous folks. I did a film called The Hand of Franklin. We rode the Northwest Passage from Inuvik, ended up in Cambridge Bay because the ice never opened up around the corner in King William Island. But that film it's kind of about climate change, but I kind of show the environment and we're the entertainment along the way, but I let the Indigenous people speak to it. So I spoke and interviewed a bunch of elders who've been there for 70 years. And they've got an actual perspective. Climate change is something you can just look at and say, oh, it's happening, especially that I'm going in different environments all the time. It's almost like, I don't think you can ever judge a single season as this is what's happening now, because the next season it might be different. You need that kind of long stretch of time to really see the changes. And yeah, so they told stories of how, say in Tuktoyaktuk, where we were, that used to be frozen year round out in the bay there, and now it's open 3 months of the year, and there's problems with erosion and that sort of thing. But that's something that I couldn't see because I hadn't been there 20, 30 years ago, but they kind of spoke. So my films and my writing often is like a vessel for people to express what's happening. And then I just kind of share their stories and don't impress my own opinion on it because they definitely know better just from their decades of being there, what's actually going on. So try to let the local people speak to that. And definitely speaking to them, they've definitely seen changes happen over the decades for sure. You need that stretch of time though to really see it for sure.
Yeah, of course. You seem to be never home, but where do you consider home or homes across Canada?
Yeah, I live in North Vancouver, BC. So I am still most years, typically I'm here 8 months of the year. My wife and I live here. She works for Lululemon in town, which is based here in Vancouver. She works for the head office there as a manager. But and then I kind of come here and it's where I'll do my writing. I also do a bit of rigging work. I work in the boat yard as well. I like to keep my hands going in there, and I also do then the polar bear guiding in the fall, Northern Lights guiding in the kind of late winter. And this year I'm actually going to work in January and February in Antarctica as an expedition guide on an expedition ship. So South Georgia, Antarctica. And instead of talking about polar bears with people, I'm talking about, penguins, albatross, whales, leopard seals, that sort of thing. So it's a different environment, different animals, and then basically running people in by Zodiac to see the wildlife there. So that's going to be between the trips to kind of make it all keep on going, right? So like I said, the trips themselves are more like a lifestyle than a living. You still have to make money doing jobs in between, right? So
yeah, as a freelancer, yes, I understand that completely.
Yeah, and then I do regular features for Explore magazine. I'll contribute some blog stuff from them as well. Write for Paddling Magazine, Mountain Life, different magazines like that to kind of fill in the gaps for writing and stuff too.
I'm sure you're going to say, no, I haven't, but you have been to almost every corner of Canada compared to other Canadians. If given the opportunity, where should every Canadian see?
I think it's all good in its own way. It depends what you want. It's like, in terms of my personal favorite trips, I think one trip that was kind of very, I did of course, the cross Canada canoe trip, but I think the Arctic is amazing as far as being it's kind of like it was, thousands of years ago in many ways. You're going down these big waterways, undammed, free flowing, lots of fish, lots of wildlife, no communities, and kind of seeing a place that has remained relatively unchanged. It's kind of a unique experience. So, I mean, the Back River is amazing, flowing all the way through the Arctic, this 1,000-kilometer long river with amazing wildlife, and takes you through that kind of heart of that kind of real barren grounds land. One day on my birthday there on the Back River, which I talk about in the trip too, it's like you come around the corner and all of a sudden the whole hillside is alive, and there were like 10,000 caribou we ran into on my birthday. So what a gift, right? And you never know what's going to happen until you come around the corner. It's like, boom, suddenly you're and there's a huge herd of caribou right alongside the river. And we just kind of hung out and watched them for like half an hour until they just kind of disappeared into this fog that kind of suddenly lowered on them. It's like they were never there, right? Or also even just seeing, this past summer on a trip, running into a barren ground grizzly that came a little bit too close, and then you suddenly feel like you're part of the food chain, right? It kind of kept on coming in. Saliva coming off its teeth, shaking its kind of head. It's on my Instagram. People can check out the video of that one. We even had a unique experience with the wolf this summer where it walked right into our camp on the Hood River. We ended up in the Hood eventually before we hit the Arctic Ocean on that trip. And it was very calm, female, small, just kind of sniffing our stuff. You could see we could scare her if we made a quick movement. But then eventually she went up on the ridge and she found my morning movement, so to speak. I'd basically taken a cow patty sized dump up on the ridge. I'd covered it up. It's tundra, it's rock. It's hard you can't really bury it up there. So kind of sand and grass, but she found it. And then joyfully for like 5 minutes, she just rolled in my dump. And it's all on another thing you can watch on my Instagram. It's this wolf just so happy. And then this kind of, gray white Arctic wolf transitioned into like the rare Arctic brown wolf. And so she had coated her entire body, and it's basically like a masking. So it's like a different scent. So it masks her scent so she can actually hunt better. And kind of, so the caribou can smell, oh, that's a wolf, but it's like a human smell. It's like, oh, that's something different. It's kind of masks her scent so she can actually hunt better. So it's kind of like an adaptation. That's why people's dogs roll in shit.
I was going to say, it reminds me like a golden retriever.
Yeah, a golden retriever. Every dog, if it's a Shih Tzu or a golden retriever, they all come from wolves originally. They have that lineage. So they still act like wolves. And that's kind of, so we saw it, up close and personal, this wolf kind of like joyfully kind of rolling around and then just happily trotting off into the tundra kind of thing. So yeah, so any of these kind of places you go in the high Arctic are amazing. The Back River or the Thelon or the Kazan River I've done as well. So all these kind of big water bodies that I've done like source to the end are kind of always a magical thing. I mean, you do a whole river from the very source to the very end. You see the whole transitions of the river. The river kind of like change over time. It'll broaden, it'll get bigger. The rapids will change. The landscape will change. And so doing one of these like big, great Arctic rivers, I would recommend to anyone. Yeah.
And is there anything left on your list of like once in a lifetime things that you want to do that you haven't yet?
Yeah, I don't really have people ask me, do I have a whole bucket list? I never really know what I'm going to do until I never look beyond the trip that's right in front of me generally. So I try to keep in that. And also things will just come across my plate, or my journeys are generally pretty obscure. I'm not necessarily ticking off lists. I'll start, usually from a town and just work my way through the waterways. If you have time, you can just work your way upstream and downstream in the old ways, right? It's kind of what I try to do. I don't tend to bush plane over and drop in somewhere for convenience. I'll try to work my way just by doing a regular kind of, say, flight to a place like Yellowknife or Whitehorse and just leave from there and kind of work my way into the wilderness kind of in an honest kind of way. So, what was the question again?
I said, is there anything on your, I didn't want to use bucket list because I know it's so like, I didn't want to use the word.
Really, it's kind of what, if interesting projects kind of pop up all the time, and some people sometimes ask me if I'm interested in something, or I'll just kind of be reading and it'll kind of, but if I have one book called Lines on a Map, and it's basically have these lines on a map of Canada, and I'm slowly just kind of filling in the lines. So it's all these red lines on Instagram, there's a map of my current lines in the map, and you can see all the trips I've done in North America, and just filling in those blank spaces over time. So if something doesn't come up this interesting project-wise, I'll just fill in another blank space. And there's so much in Canada. It seems like I've done a lot, but there's so many more wilderness lines and rivers and landscapes and mountains to kind of explore and discover. There's lifetimes and lifetimes of that. So I definitely have no shortage of possibilities.
Yeah, literally lifetimes it would take to explore every corner.
Exactly.
Frank, thank you so much for taking time today. And hopefully one day my boyfriend and I can be guided by you for polar bears in Churchill, Manitoba.
Yeah, come on up. It's a great time. Frontiers North, a great company, Canadian company, Manitoba owned. And it's a real family atmosphere. We bring everyone into that kind of experience and share our passion for the bears up there. So
thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more Let's Take This Outside, go to letstakethisoutside.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.